I've never been much of a believer in ghosts, demons, or any of the things people like to scare themselves with. I've spent too many years in uniform, seeing the things people do to one another, to believe in anything that isn't cold and concrete. The real monsters are human, not shadows in the corner or whispers in the dark. At least, that's what I used to think. I've been with the Sheriff's Department in Maple Hollow for 10 years. Maple Hollow isn't the kind of place where things happen, not really. A population just under 2,000, mostly farmers and retirees. It's the kind of town where people leave their doors unlocked and say hello to their neighbors every morning. The biggest crimes I deal with are bar fights or the occasional trespassing call. But something changed 2 months ago. It started with a call from a woman on the outskirts of town, an old widow named Mrs. Harrison. She claimed she heard noises in her basement at night, scratching, voices. "It's probably just raccoons," I told her over the phone. The woman was known to be a bit paranoid, calling the station for every bump in the night. Still, I went over, part of the job. I found nothing. No raccoons, no signs of forced entry, just a dark, damp basement that smelled like mildew. Mrs. Harrison seemed relieved, but she kept looking at me strangely, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. I brushed it off, got back into my cruiser, and headed home, already forgetting about it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake a feeling. Something about that basement had been off. The next morning, Mrs. Harrison was dead. I was the first one on the scene the next morning. Mrs. Harrison's neighbor had called it in after she noticed her front door ajar and hadn't seen her come out for her morning walk. The neighbor didn't go inside, just stood on the porch and peeked through the crack in the door. I pulled into the driveway a few minutes later. It was a gray morning, cold for early fall, and there was a dampness in the air that clung to my skin. Mrs. Harrison's house sat still, the front door hanging open like a silent invitation. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, but it felt different from the last time I'd been there. Heavier, somehow. The living room looked untouched. Knickknacks on shelves, a quilt draped over the arm of the chair where she used to sit. But then I noticed the faint smell, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable. A mix of earth and something metallic. I found her in the basement. She was lying at the bottom of the stairs, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, face down in a pool of her own blood. It looked like she had fallen, hitting her head on the concrete floor. An accident by all accounts, but something didn't sit right with me. Her arms were stretched out in front of her, as if she had been reaching for something, or running from something. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at her. My skin prickled with a cold, creeping sensation I couldn't explain. I radioed it in, and soon after, the coroner arrived. They confirmed what I already knew. She was dead. A fall, they said. These things happen with the elderly, especially if they live alone. People trip, lose their balance, and that's it. But the look on her face, that wasn't the face of someone who just fell. It was twisted, mouth open, eyes wide, like she had seen something terrifying in those final moments. I left the house, but the image of her contorted face stayed with me. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt since I started this job: fear. The days that followed blurred together, but that feeling, like a weight pressing on my chest, never left. I started having trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see her, lying there at the bottom of those stairs, reaching for something unseen. Then the calls started. It wasn't unusual to get calls about strange noises. People in a town this size have wild imaginations. But it was the pattern that caught my attention. always the same thing. People hearing voices in their houses. Quiet at first, like a whisper, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The first call came from an older man, Mr. Gray, who lived about a mile from where Mrs. Harrison had died. He claimed he could hear someone talking in his house at night, a voice that seemed to come from the walls. "What do they say?" I asked when I visited him. "I don't know," he said, looking out the window with bloodshot eyes. "It's never clear, just words. I can't make them out." I checked the house. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No signs of anyone. Mr. Gray thanked me, but he had that same look Mrs. Harrison had before she died. Like he wanted to say more but couldn't bring himself to. I left, the sense of unease growing. A week passed, then another. The calls became more frequent. Different people, different parts of town, but the same story. Whispers in the night. Something about it gnawed at me, made it hard to think about anything else. One night, after another sleepless stretch, I heard it. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to sleep when I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind brushing past the house, a soft rustling. But then it became clearer. A voice, not loud, but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The whispering seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the house was alive, murmuring secrets. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, just beyond the edge of understanding. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of bed, moving quietly through the house. Every step felt like a violation, like I was intruding on something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. I followed the sound down the hallway, through the living room and into the basement. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand. The air was thick, heavy, like the basement was holding its breath. I could still hear the whispering, clearer now, but still indecipherable. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the sound swallowed by the dark. At the bottom, I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room. Empty, just the same old basement. But then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just behind an old, dust-covered shelf, there was something on the wall. At first, I thought it was a crack, just part of the house settling over the years. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a crack. It was a hole. Small, no bigger than a quarter, but it was there, perfectly round, as if something had bored into the wall from the other side. I leaned in, holding my breath, and listened. The whispering was louder now, seeping through the hole like a draft. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make sense of the sound, trying to understand the words. But as I listened, a chill ran down my spine. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from within. I pulled back from the wall so fast that I nearly lost my balance. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath felt shallow, forced. I stared at the small hole, unable to shake the feeling that it was somehow watching me. I could still hear the whispers, muffled, distant, but they were clearer now. The sound crawled under my skin like an itch I couldn't reach, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel safe in my own home. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the living room, sitting upright in the dark, trying to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of my exhausted mind. But the longer I sat there, the more the whispers echoed in my head, gnawing at me. I kept thinking about Mrs. Harrison, about her twisted body at the bottom of the stairs, about the look in her eyes. I should have told someone, maybe even gotten out of town. But what could I say? That I'd found a hole in the wall and heard something strange. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. So instead, I buried it. I buried the fear and focused on my job, hoping it would distract me from whatever was happening. But the town didn't let me forget. The calls kept coming in, more frequent now and more intense. People who had lived in Maple Hollow their entire lives were suddenly scared of their own homes. Mr. Gray called again, saying the whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and he swore he could hear them even during the day now. Others reported strange things too, missing items, cold drafts in rooms with no windows, the feeling of being watched when no one was there. Each story was different, but the common thread was always the same: the whispers. And then the deaths started. At first, they seemed like accidents. People falling downstairs, drowning in bathtubs, car crashes on empty roads late at night. But I knew. I knew because every single one of them had called the station in the days leading up to their deaths, complaining about the whispers. And every time I showed up to investigate, I found nothing. Just the echo of fear in their empty houses. It was about a month after Mrs. Harrison died that I got the call from my own dispatcher. A routine check, she said. Someone had reported strange noises coming from the abandoned house at the edge of town, the old Pearson place. No one had lived there for years, not since the family had packed up and moved out in the dead of night, leaving the house to rot. I drove to the house just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty field that stretched out behind the house. The place looked like a skeleton, its windows dark and hollow, its roof sagging like it had given up long ago. I parked the car and stepped out, the air suddenly colder than it had been just minutes before. I stared at the house, feeling that same weight pressing down on my chest. The whispers were there, faint at first, carried on the wind. But as I approached the front door, they grew louder, clearer. This time I could make out the words. They weren't random after all. They were saying my name. The door creaked open with little effort, and the smell of rot hit me instantly. The house had been abandoned for years, but it felt alive. I walked through the front hallway, my flashlight cutting through the dust and shadows, every step punctuated by the whispers. My name, over and over again, like a chant. I forced myself to keep moving, to keep searching, but every instinct in my body told me to turn around and leave. I made my way to the staircase, the same staircase I'd seen so many times in reports, the same one people had fallen down to their deaths. As I climbed, I could feel the walls closing in on me, the air thick with something I couldn't name. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and my own thoughts seemed to fade into the background, lost in the noise. I reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the hallway, but something caught my eye. At the far end of the hall, there was a door slightly ajar, a faint light flickering from within. I hesitated for only a second before moving toward it, the sound of my name still buzzing in my ears. When I pushed the door open, I was met with a sight that made my stomach lurch. It was me. A mirror stood in the center of the room, covered in dust and grime, but through the haze, I could see myself standing there. Except, it wasn't quite right. The figure in the mirror was moving, but I wasn't. I watched as it reached out toward me, its face twisted in a grotesque grin, its eyes wide and unblinking. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the doorframe, and fell to the ground. The figure in the mirror mimicked my movement, but its grin only widened, stretching its mouth into something unnatural. Then it spoke. "You can't leave." The voice wasn't mine. It was cold, empty, like the whispering I'd been hearing for weeks. The figure's hand pressed against the glass, its eyes locked onto mine. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just in my head. It wasn't just paranoia. Something was here, and it had been watching me the whole time. I scrambled to my feet, the whispers now a cacophony of voices, all saying the same thing. "You can't leave." I don't remember how I got out of the house, only that I ran. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car, hands shaking, the engine roaring as I sped down the road away from the Pearson place. But no matter how far I drove, I could still hear it. My name, whispered, over and over, from the walls, from the air, from within. The days after the Pearson house incident passed in a haze. I felt like I was floating through the hours, disconnected from everything around me. My body went through the motions, getting up, driving to work, responding to calls. But my mind was somewhere else. At the station, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows slipping between the walls. I stopped telling anyone about it. The last time I'd mentioned the whispers, one of the other officers gave me a strange look, like he was waiting for the punchline to a joke that never came. I couldn't explain what was happening to me without sounding insane, but I knew it wasn't just in my head. I could feel it. Something was watching me. Something was waiting for me to crack. I started avoiding mirrors. Every time I caught my reflection, I'd see it. The twisted grin, the wrongness in the eyes, like something was mimicking me, but getting it just slightly off. It made my skin crawl. I smashed the mirror in my bathroom after I saw my reflection lingering for a second too long after I turned away. For a moment, I was naive enough to think that things would calm down after smashing the mirror. In reality, it only got worse. The voices, they weren't confined to just whispers anymore. They started slipping into everyday sounds. The hum of the fridge, the wind outside, even the static crackle of the police radio. But now, they weren't just saying my name. They were taunting me. I'd hear snatches of words, cruel and mocking, telling me I couldn't run, that I couldn't hide. It was everywhere. One late evening, I heard something new. A low laugh, rumbling just behind me, so close I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing, just empty air. But I knew I wasn't alone. And then it started showing itself. The first time, it was a shadow in the corner of my eye, darting just out of view. My nerves frayed to the breaking point. But the second time, it was more than just a shadow. I was sitting in the patrol car, parked at the edge of the woods on a routine watch. It was quiet, the only light coming from the pale glow of the dashboard. I'd just poured myself some coffee when I noticed it. The passenger seat belt was buckled. I froze, terror gripping me, as all the blood seemed to leave my face. No one had been in the car with me. No one had touched that belt. My hands shook as I unbuckled it, eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Nothing but dark trees and the faint shimmer of moonlight off the windshield. But then I saw movement. At first, it was just a faint ripple across the glass, like a heat wave. Then, as I leaned in closer, it sharpened. A shape pressed against the back window. I barely had time to react before the thing jerked toward me, slamming against the glass. A handprint smeared in condensation, like something had breathed onto the window from the inside. I floored it, the car tearing down the road, the handprint still burning in my mind. Whatever it was getting angrier. That night, I woke to the sound of something dragging across the floor downstairs. It was slow, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across wood. I lay there, heart hammering. The sound only grew louder, creeping its way up the stairs. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of bed, my hands trembling as I stepped into the hallway. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by a faint, rhythmic thumping. My throat tightened as I approached the top of the stairs, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I pointed it downward. Nothing. I forced myself to take another step, my bare feet cold against the floor. Then I heard it. A whisper, clear and sharp, right behind me. You shouldn't have looked. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. The whisper came again, closer now, almost as if it were coming from the walls themselves. You shouldn't have looked. My body went ice cold. I froze in place, my flashlight slipping from my grip and crashing to the floor with a hollow thud. For a split second, everything went still until I felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, brushed the back of my neck. The skin there prickled, like death had reached out to touch me. My breath hitched, panic seizing my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I whipped around, heart slamming against my ribs, and that's when I saw it. In the faint glow of the flickering light, a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs grotesquely long, twisted in ways that no human should bend. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, neck bent like a snapped twig. And its eyes, black, hollow, hungry, locked onto mine. It wasn't just looking at me. It was studying me, as if it had been waiting all along, lurking in the shadows, biding its time. I froze, my limbs betraying me, rooted to the spot. The thing tilted its head, a sharp, jerky movement, and then it took a step forward, its long fingers twitching, reaching for me. I tried to move, but my feet felt glued to the floor, like the very house was holding me down, refusing to let me escape. The lights flickered again, and I saw the creature inch closer, its hand stretching toward me, fingers bending like broken bones. That was all it took. I bolted, tearing my legs free from whatever invisible force had gripped them, my heart hammering so loud I thought it might burst. My flashlight bounced wildly as I raced down the stairs, the beam catching glimpses of walls warping, the house groaning like a living thing in pain. The air grew thick, choking, as the sound of something scraping, dragging along the floorboards followed me. I burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My legs moved on their own, pumping furiously beneath me as I sprinted away from the house, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The ground was uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't care. I ran, faster than I ever had. My breaths came in ragged, desperate gasps, every inhale burning my throat, but I kept going. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't risk seeing that thing again. The one I knew was still there, waiting, lurking just beyond the door. The wind whipped around me, biting and sharp, but it wasn't just the cold that sent shivers down my spine. The whispers were still there, faint but relentless, carried on the wind like a cruel reminder that I couldn't outrun it. I pushed harder, nearly tripping over myself as I made my way through the yard and down the dirt road. My flashlight had long since fallen, abandoned somewhere in the house. It didn't matter. I didn't need it anymore. I just needed to get away. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I had to leave Maple Hollow. I relocated to a city a few hours away. A new apartment, a new job, a fresh start. For a while, it felt like I could breathe again. The whispers were gone. The cold hand that had been gripping my life for months loosened just enough for me to believe I might actually be free. Weeks passed, and I almost convinced myself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination, a figment of my exhausted mind. Almost. But then it started again. It was small at first, just a feeling, a sense that I was being watched. I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, turn to find nothing. I don't know what followed me from Maple Hollow, or if it was there before I ever stepped foot into that cursed town. I don't know if it was ever real or if I'm just losing my mind. But I'm not the same person I was. Something changed. I don't hear the whispers as much anymore, but the feeling never really leaves. It's always there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear something moving behind the walls, just on the edge of hearing. Scratching, dragging. I haven't gone back to Maple Hollow, and I never will. And if you ever find yourself passing through that town, do yourself a favor. Whatever you do, don't look in the mirrors.